Romans chapter 1, verse 16 says that the gospel, the good news about Jesus Christ, is God's dynamite. That makes it powerful. We're going to discuss that today.
Till the good news was written and the full truth revealed, that the church might be whole and Christ's fullness made real. Our Lord in His wisdom gave men gifts from above. The Spirit then taught them the truth in love.
Welcome to The Truth in Love. And now your host, Dave Miller.
Greetings and thank you for watching the program. We are now in the midst of a study of the book of Romans, 16 chapters, incredible treatise written by Paul way back in the first century, inspired of God, designed to identify for us the concept of justification and how it fits into God's scheme of things. It's good for us to quickly summarize by comparing the book of Romans to the book of Acts, which will help to kind of orient us as to the basic thrust of Romans. Acts portrays the conditions of salvation, whereas Romans gives us the grounds of salvation. So that's a good contrast to help us to see the difference from the beginning. Chapter 1, verse 16, of course, is the thesis of the book, where Paul declared that he was not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. So if you get nothing else out of our study of the book of Romans, understand that this book is designed to tell us that the gospel is God's power to save all who will respond in obedient faith. Let's look at our outline and see where we are. We've looked at the first 6 chapters, and we are in the midst of chapter 7. With the thematic statement of chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, the book moves into a discussion of the great need of the human race, both Jew and Gentile. And what we need, of course, is salvation from sin. We then moved to chapter 3 and went through chapter 5 and saw the solution, the gospel, illustrated in Abraham and the benefits and the extent of the blessings of salvation. Then beginning in chapter 6 and extending for 3 chapters, we have a section that I've entitled Sin Since the Gospel. In other words, what about sin now that you're a Christian? And what was our condition in terms of sin leading up to becoming a Christian? And that's really more what's going on in chapter 7. So what I would like for us to do is to go back to chapter 7. We were down to about verse 9. Let's read this verse together and think through what Paul is saying. Romans chapter 7, verse 9. I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. So what he's talking about here is that prior to the law being a part of his life, that's talking about back when we were children. When we're children, we are innocent, we are immature, we're not accountable. Children are not accountable in our society until they reach a certain age. Paul said that's the way it is for all of us. But then a point came in our life, that's when we're without the law. That is, we are pre-adult, pre-accountability. But then when the commandment came, he said, that is, when we reached an age of adult responsibility and became aware of the demands and the requirements of God's commandments, he says that's when sin revived. And perhaps that's a poor translation because revived sounds like it was vived and then it's revived. But it really means it burst forth in his life. It sprung forth, came to life. Sin was non-existent when you're not accountable to God. But then when you become accountable and you violate His will, sin bursts into life in your own life. And he said, that's when I died. That's when I spiritually became dead. Now look back at this chart. This proves that children are in a safe condition. We don't have to use the word saved because saved implies that you've done something wrong and then been forgiven. No, they were in a safe condition, not responsible, not accountable. When infants die, I am convinced the Bible teaches that they will ultimately be in heaven because they're not guilty. But at some point in our lives, we reach accountability, we reach adulthood, and we become sinners. We violate God's will. We're responsible for that. Hence, we are lost spiritually. But then there comes a point where we are exposed to the gospel, Lord, hopefully, and we respond and we become a Christian. We are saved. That's what Paul is talking about here with these concepts. So, to be alive spiritually means to be made to be forgiven, so that you're no longer dead in sin. And those are the concepts that he's trying to get across. So let's look at verse 10 and see how his discussion develops. In verse 10, read this with me. He says, "And the commandment which was to bring life, I found to bring death." Let's pause and think about what he's saying. What do you mean the commandment was intended to bring life? That's what all of God's commands are designed to do. God wouldn't give us a command, a law, a statute, a regulation that was not intended to do something good for us. Do you remember the statement made in Deuteronomy 30, verse 15? That here God's commands are for good, they're for life. That's what God intends for them to be. But if we disobey God's commandments, then spiritual death occurs. It is pronounced upon us by the very law which we violated. You remember Romans chapter 6, verse 16? There's only two approaches to life. You either live a life of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. So if we violate law, if we sin, then we are bringing about our own death. Many things have been given by God in the physical realm that are intended for our good, but which can end up being to our detriment. You know, for example, water. What if we didn't have water? The majority of the human body is composed of water. The majority of planet Earth is composed of water. We need water to drink. The plants need it. Water is absolutely essential to life. And yet it can drown you. Water can kill you. There are many such things. The sun is necessary for life. We have to have sunshine for life to exist, but the sun can burn you. It can bring harm upon you. And so it is even in the spiritual realm. There are things that God intends for our good, but we can abuse and misuse. Law is for good, but if you violate law, then you have committed sin. And law pronounces upon you judgment and death. That brings us then to chapter 7, verse 11. "For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me." Interesting how he personifies the word commandment as if it is a person. What he's talking about here is just exactly what Satan did to Adam and Eve. Do you remember in the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 3, chapter 2 and 3 really, God gave a command to Adam and Eve. Don't eat the fruit of this tree. You can eat of all these other trees, but don't eat the fruit of this tree. Do you know Satan took that very command from God, which was meant for good, and used the circumstance posed by that command from God. He used that to deceive Eve and to kill her spiritually. That's what Romans 7:11 means. Sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me. Do you know every single one of us are in that same predicament? Romans 7:11 applies to every single one of us. Look at verse 12 and read this verse with me. "Therefore, the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good." If you have interpreted the book of Romans or anything else in the Bible to be negative against law, if you have had the impression law is bad and to give too much attention to law is legalistic, we're under grace, we're not under law, if you have that idea, Romans 7:12 ought to cause you to rethink your position. Nowhere does the Bible teach that law is bad. We've misunderstood it if we think it teaches that, because the law is from God. God never gives anybody anything bad. It is always good. And here he declares it plainly. Law is for our good. We had to be delivered from law in the sense that we needed to be saved from the consequences of our violations of law. In other words, we do not want to be under a strictly legal system. We don't want to be out from a legal system, But we want more than that. We need a means built into the legal system that will enable us to be forgiven of sin. That's the gospel. That's Christianity, and that's what it's designed to do. Law does not, that doesn't make law sin. Law was designed by God to promote holiness, justice, and goodness. That's what it's intended to do. That brings us then to verse 13. Has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. You see, God's commandments do not bring death. Sin's what brings death. Violation of God's commandments is what brings death. So in that sense, sin brings death through the commandment. But the commandment's good. Only God's commands can expose the true extent of the destructiveness of sin. And that makes it good. Remember chapter 3, verse 20? By the knowledge of law, we learn what sin is. So in chapter 7, moving down to verse 14, read this with me. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. Now, here's where this section commences, extending down to verse 25. Chapter 7, verse 14, extending down to verse 25, where I believe there's been a lot of misunderstanding, where people have thought that Paul's talking about himself, and he's talking about himself as a Christian and the struggle that Christians go through in dealing with sin. I think that's out of harmony with the thrust of Romans and what Paul is attempting to accomplish. So two errors typically are advocated on this section of the book of Romans. One, that Paul was rejecting law-keeping as part of the plan of salvation. That's not true, can't be true. Number two, that Paul's use of the first person singular means that he was referring to his own life as a Christian. But I believe that's an incorrect assessment of what he's talking about here. When he says in chapter 7, verse 14, the law is spiritual, what he's saying is it is addressed to the spirit. It is addressed to the human mind, to the human spirit. That's what makes the law spiritual. God has always addressed Himself to a human personality, the human spirit, the mind. Christianity is first and foremost a religion of the mind. It's intended to be cognitive. It's intended to be rational. You have to understand information, assess and assimilate truth, and then apply it to your body and your actions. So the law is spiritual. Deuteronomy chapter 6, you remember, even in the Old Testament, that's how the law is depicted. Whenever Moses said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, he said, these words shall be in your heart. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 6. That's what he means by the law is spiritual. What does he mean, I am carnal? I am sold under sin. He has to be referring to his pre-Christian enslavement to sin. He can't be talking about his spiritual condition as an apostle of Jesus Christ. Carnal? Sold into sin? No, Paul wasn't perfect. No one is. But he was a righteous and valiant soldier of the cross. So the carnality that he's referring to has to be a reference to his pre-Christian condition, and he's referring really to all of us. Everyone prior to their embracing of Christ in the gospel are carnal and sold under sin. Now look at verse 15. Read this verse with me. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that's what I do. In other words, he's again describing this pre-Christian condition where we have no hope. He's saying the sinner is aware of his or her evil action, but he doesn't grasp the real nature and the consequence of sin. You remember when Jesus prayed from the cross, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. What did he mean? Did he mean they were not consciously aware that they were hammering him to the cross? Of course not. He meant they're not grasping the true significance of their actions. The way Peter put it in Paul in 1 Corinthians 2:8, for had they known they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So sinners can actually be aware that what they're doing is evil. They're aware of their own actions because of the grief that comes upon them and that results in their life. They're unhappy. They're miserable. But without Christ, without the gospel and submission to the gospel teaching, that sinner is held captive under the reign of sin and has no way out unless God offers a way out. Look at verse 16. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. Even the worst of sinners understands and acknowledges that there is a standard, that there is law. There is a standard, an authority structure that distinguishes between right and wrong, good and bad. But you know what? Without the gospel system, such a person cannot be forgiven. And he is therefore unable to translate his better judgment into reality. We've got to have the gospel to get us out from under the reign of sin. And so he says in verse 17, but now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. Again, Paul has to be referring to his pre-Christian condition. He has to be saying that sin may enter the life of a Christian. But sin enters the life of a Christian as a foreigner, as an alien, as an invader. It's not a way of life. It's not a fair summary of that person's existence. It may not be said that sin dwells. That's the term that he uses in Romans 7:17, that sin lives, it resides, it's taken up residence in him, not the Christian. So he has to be talking about our pre-Christian condition. Does Paul mean that sinners are not responsible for their sin? You know, when Paul says, it's no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells in me. That sounds like back in the 60s where Flip Wilson said, the devil made me do it. And certainly we're living in a culture that has attempted to not be responsible for and accountable for our own decisions and choices. But that's not what the Bible teaches anywhere. So what Paul has to be saying in verse 17 is a figure of speech. You would have to insert the word only in order to make sense of what he's saying. Insert the word only after the word I. This is the case with a lot of verses in the Bible. John 12:44, 1 John chapter 3, verse 18. He's saying, therefore, it is no longer I only who do it. That person's deciding to sin. So he means not only is the non-Christian guilty of sin by choice, but it is also the case that the sinner is under the reign of sin, the power of sin, and the sinner is powerless to free himself. Therefore, we need a solution. Notice what he says then in verse 18. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good, I do not find. What's he talking about here? Well, our physical bodies, you know, with all of our hormones, our appetites, our desires, our passions, you understand that God made all of that to be morally neutral. None of those things are evil in and of themselves. They're part of the human package. And God created us, so it can't be evil in and of itself. So, he's saying that when you enlist the aid of your mind, when you use your mind to decide to take your fleshly appetites and to gratify them in ways that God does not approve of, that's when you engage in sin. We may intend to comply. We may will. It may be our desire to comply with law completely. But under law alone, with no gospel, once you sin, then you are lost. Sin cannot be detached from you so that you can give yourself to living a pure life. You do not have it within your ability to erase your own sin. Hence, something has to be done in your behalf. Notice what else we have. Continuing on, Romans chapter 7, let's look at verse 19. For the good that I will to do, I do not do, but the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now, if I do what I will not to do, it's no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. These two verses really repeat the thought of verses 15 and 17. It's repetitious. Again, the point is that the alien sinner, he's talking about a person before they become a Christian, the alien sinner is helpless and hell-bound without Christ and without the gospel. The inner man, our spirits, are in a life and death struggle with our fleshly passions. We cannot overcome them without the gospel. We need Christ, the saving power of the gospel, in order to overcome and to get out of our predicament. That brings us to verse 21. I find then a law that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man. I think the New King James is a little bit obscure in its rendering of these two verses, 21 and 22. Paul's saying that on the inside, inwardly, the sinner endorses the law of God. He can understand and mentally affirm with the goodness and the rightness and the truth of law. But without the gospel, without the redeeming salvation available in Jesus, the sinner is helpless to overcome the rule of sin. The inward man he refers to, that is the mind, the spirit, so the inward man is your mind, it is your spirit, it is your will. And he's saying here that even the most abject criminal, you could go to a prison and find the worst sinner, the person who's violated the most laws, the worst criminal, who will still talk with you about good and right and know what those are. The only exception I can see to that would be what Paul in 1 Timothy 4:2 calls having your conscience seared. You could sin so much and so long that you sear your conscience, where you no longer have feelings that inform you of what is right and good. But I think his point is that the average person still understands that, even though they're lost in sin and continuing to pursue that lifestyle. Now look at verse 23 of chapter 7. But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. Members, of course, here is talking about our fleshly bodies. When he says, I see another law, he's talking about the rule of sin, the law of sin and death. When he refers to the law of my mind, he's talking about God's law, the gospel, which is addressed to the mind. There's the law of my mind, the law that God intends for my mind to approve of and to endorse and to live by. It is the law of our mind that will enable us to bring our bodies and our passions under control to the service of God. And then when he says in verse 24 that I'm brought into captivity, he's talking about the fact that the non-Christian, before you become a Christian, you are not in a position to win the war between your mind and your fleshly passions because you do not have the gospel. But if you get the saving message of Jesus, if you study your New Testament, if you hear the gospel proclaimed and the good news of Jesus Christ and what He's done and what He offers, if we will respond submissively and obediently, then you see you are in a position to extricate yourself from your sad dilemma. When he says, I am sold under sin, back in chapter 7, verse 14, he means the same thing that he meant in chapter 6, verse 17. And that's where he said, we are a slave of sin if we do not respond to the gospel. Now, we're bringing this chapter to a close. Listen closely. Verse 24, O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Here is the mournful, desperate cry of a non-Christian who is dead in sin, spiritually deceased, unable to revive himself, even though he wants to, even though he desires to be saved. He's lost. He has no way of escape on his own. Here is the condition of every accountable person on this planet who has not obeyed the gospel of Christ. What is the solution? Verse 25. I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. There is the solution. Chapter 7 verse 25 and chapter 8 verse 1 are high water marks of this book. Here I am, a non-Christian, lost in sin, sold in sin, nothing I can do to get myself out of this. What do I need? Thank God through Jesus Christ. What does He mean by that? He means the answer is Christ, what Christ has done. The good news, He's died for us. He's made salvation and forgiveness available. Deliverance from sin. That's good news. That's atonement made available to us. This verse is a restatement of the thesis of 1:16. Good place for us to stop. I'll be back in just a moment. Please don't go away.
A common love for each other, a common gift to the Savior, a common bond holding us to the Lord, a common strength when we're weary, a common hope for tomorrow, a common joy. Truth of God's Word, a common love for each other, a common gift to the Savior, a common bond holding us to the Lord, a common strength when we're weary, a common hope. Tomorrow, a common joy in the truth of God's Word.
I'm just thrilled. I'm just elated when I study what Paul has to say in the book of Romans about our spiritual condition and our hope in Christ. My presentation and explanation and attempt to teach you may be lacking, but that information, those truths there, will cause a person to be sustained for life and eternity if we will embrace them and complete our submission to them. Maybe you would like to have this whole series on the book of Romans sent to your home in the form of audio cassette tapes. Do you know we would be happy to send these to you without any cost, without any obligation? If you'll write us this week at The Truth in Love, P.O. Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. Request the series on the book of Romans, the meaning of Romans. We'll be happy to send it to you free of charge. Tune in next time when we continue our study of this great book. I look forward to seeing you then.
Now the full revelation has been given to man. Let us strive for the kingdom by God's clear plan. We must never be swayed by the doctrines of men. Speak the truth.